The morning Ida Blackwell decided she would plant the south field alone, the sun had not yet fully risen above the Kansas plains, and her hands were already blistered from 3 days of preliminary work that would have broken a lesser woman entirely. Thomas Blackwell had been dead for 7 months, 2 weeks and 4 days. Ida knew the count without trying, the same way she knew the number of fence posts that needed replacing along the eastern pasture, the same way she knew exactly how many jars of preserved peaches remained in the cellar below the farmhouse. She was a woman who kept count of things because counting was a way of maintaining some grip on a world that had decided, without consulting her, to turn itself completely upside down. Thomas had gone quickly, which was the one mercy in the whole terrible business. A fever that came on in November and burned itself out along with the man who carried it, leaving Ida standing in the doorway of their bedroom on a Wednesday morning, holding a bowl of broth that would go uneaten, staring at a body that had been a husband just 12 hours before. She was 28 years old. They had been married 6 years. They had built the farm together from raw Kansas dirt and pure stubborn will, and now she was alone on it, and the question the whole county seemed to want answered was what she intended to do about that. What she intended to do, as it turned out, was plant the fields. People in Harding County, Kansas, in the spring of 1882 had opinions about this. The Reverend's wife, Mabel Fitch, came by with a pie and a suggestion that perhaps Ida ought to consider selling the property and finding suitable lodging with a female relative. Ida thanked her for the pie and said she had no female relatives who lived nearby and no intention of selling. Her neighbor to the north, a heavy-set man named Garland Prout, who had made 2 different offers on the Blackwell land since November, came by with a more direct suggestion that the farm was too much for a woman alone and that he would give her a fair price. Ida told him the price would never be fair enough and asked him to remove himself from her porch. She had a daughter, Clara, who was 9 years old, with Thomas's dark eyes and Ida's own stubborn jaw, and between the 2 of them they had managed the chickens and the small kitchen garden through the winter. But the south field was 40 acres of prime wheat land, and the north field was another 30 acres that Thomas had planned to put into corn, and there was no managing 40 or 30 acres with a woman and a 9-year-old child, no matter how determined the woman or how willing the child. Ida knew this. She knew it in her back and her shoulders and her blistered palms, and in the practical accounting ledger she kept in the kitchen drawer, where the numbers told a story that was not encouraging. What she also knew, though she could not have explained it in plain terms to anyone who might have asked, was that leaving those fields unplanted felt like agreeing that Thomas was truly gone and that everything he had worked for was gone along with him. She was not ready to agree to that. She might never be ready to agree to that. Pride was the only armor she had left, and she wore it like a second skin. The morning in question was the 3rd week of April, which was already running late for a proper wheat planting in that part of Kansas, and Ida was in the south field with a hand plow that was designed for a man of considerably more physical mass than she possessed, dragging it through soil that needed to be turned, and doing it through sheer force of refusal to stop when she heard a horse on the road. She did not look up. People passed on the road. It was not her concern. The horse slowed. She kept her head down and her hands on the plow handles and her attention on the furrow she was cutting, which was not as straight as Thomas would have cut it, but it was a furrow, and it was hers. "Morning," a man's voice said. Ida stopped. She straightened. She turned around. He was sitting on a chestnut horse at the edge of her fence line, a tall man with dark hair that needed cutting and 3 days of beard across his jaw, wearing trail-dusty clothes that marked him as someone who had been riding for a while. He had steady gray eyes that were looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. Not pity, exactly. Not the particular brand of condescension she had grown accustomed to in the 7 months since Thomas died. Something else. "Morning," she said, and her voice was flat and not particularly welcoming because she had learned that welcoming got you Garland Prout on your porch. "You need a hand with that," he said, nodding at the plow. "No," she said. He looked at the field for a moment. It was not an unkind look. Then he looked back at her. "Wheat. Was planning on it," she said. "Ground's hard," he observed. "I noticed," she said. He seemed to consider something. He did not immediately leave, which was not what she had expected. Most men, when told no by a woman, had the decency to accept it and move along. This one appeared to be turning something over in his mind. "I'm looking for work," he said finally. "Passing through Harding County heading west. Heard in town there might be farm work to be had." "Who told you that in town?" "Man at the feed store," he said. "Willis, I think his name was." Old Donald Willis, who ran the feed store on Main Street in Cutter Creek, who had known Thomas Blackwell for years and had taken Ida's credit on spring seed supplies without blinking, and who had probably sent this man here out of some misguided sense of charity. She felt a small, hot flicker of irritation at Donald Willis, mixed with a complicated gratitude she was not willing to acknowledge out loud. "I pay fair wages," she said, before she had quite decided to say it. "I don't need much," he said. "I didn't ask what you need," she said. "I said I pay fair wages. There's a barn with a hayloft that's dry and will do for sleeping. Meals come with the work, $3 a week if you stay through harvest." She watched him receive this information. He did not haggle, which she respected. A man who haggled over fair wages told you something about his character. "Micah Atkins," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "Ida Blackwell," she said. "The plow's yours if you want to start today." He swung down from the horse in a single easy motion, tied the animal to her fence post with practiced efficiency, and came through the gate she indicated. He took the plow handles from her without ceremony, without the particular brand of self-congratulation she had braced for, and began to work the south field, and the furrows he cut were notably straighter than hers had been. Ida Blackwell went back to the farmhouse, stood in her kitchen for approximately 30 seconds, and then sat down at the table and pressed both hands flat against the worn wood surface, and reminded herself that this was a practical arrangement and nothing else. A hired hand. She had needed one. Now she had one. That was the beginning and the end of it. She was not entirely successful at believing this, but she went ahead and put the coffee on regardless. Micah Atkins had not been entirely forthcoming with Ida Blackwell on the morning of their first meeting, though he had not lied to her either. He was indeed passing through Harding County heading west, and he had indeed heard in town that there might be farm work to be had, and all of that was true as far as it went. What was also true, though he did not volunteer it, was that the particular brand of purpose that had driven him west from Missouri was one that he had been increasingly unable to identify with any precision. He was 31 years old, which in 1882 in Kansas meant he was not a young man precisely, though not an old one either. He had spent his 20s doing the things that men did on the frontier: ranch work, trail drives, a year working cattle in Texas, another year working horses in Wyoming Territory. He was skilled at the work of the land, at animals and tools and the practical management of difficult terrain. He had been on his way somewhere vaguely further west when something about the red morning sky over the Kansas plains had made him slow his horse, and something about the sight of a woman alone in a field with a plow too heavy for her had made him stop entirely. He could not have said what it was, exactly. He was not a man given to mystical interpretations of things. But there had been something in the set of her shoulders, the absolute refusal to look up even when she had clearly heard him ride to her fence, the visible exhaustion and the equally visible determination that held the exhaustion at bay, that had done something peculiar to his chest. He had been looking for work, that was true. But the moment she had said $3 a week and fair wages with that flat, clear voice that expected to be doubted and was determined not to show it, he had known he was going to take the job even if she had offered nothing at all. This was not information he planned to share with Ida Blackwell anytime soon. He worked the south field through the morning and into the afternoon, and she brought him water at midday without being asked, and without speaking more than 3 words, and he drank it and thanked her and went back to work. She worked alongside him in the afternoon, planting the seed corn he turned up the rows for in the north section, moving with a steady, measured efficiency that told him she had been doing physical work all her life and did not require his admiration or his observation of it. He gave her neither. Clara Blackwell appeared at the fence at around 4 in the afternoon, watching him with Thomas's dark eyes and a 9-year-old's complete lack of social caution. "Are you a real cowboy?" she asked. "Depending on how you define the term," Micah said, not stopping his work. "Do you have a gun?" "Clara," Ida said from across the row. "I do," Micah said. "In my saddlebag, not on my person because I'm doing farm work and it would be in the way." Clara considered this with apparent satisfaction and went to collect the eggs from the chicken house. At supper, Ida put food on the table without particular ceremony: pork and beans and cornbread and coffee, and Micah ate at the table because she indicated the chair with a nod that suggested not sitting would be impolite. Clara asked him 17 questions during the meal. He answered all of them. Ida said very little, but he was beginning to develop the sense that this was not coldness exactly. It was a kind of careful attention. She was listening to the answers he gave her daughter and forming assessments based on them, and he found he did not mind this at all. "You can take the hayloft," Ida said when supper was over. "I'll have Clara put blankets up." "I've got my own," he said. She nodded. "Then I'll see you at daybreak." He was there at daybreak. He was there the morning after that, and the one after that, and 1 week folded into 2 and then into 3, and the south field got planted and stayed planted, and Micah Atkins became a fixture at the Blackwell farm in the way that things which belong somewhere tend to become fixtures, gradually and then completely. The second week, he noticed the eastern fence line. He spent 3 days replacing posts on his own time, after the field work was done, without mentioning it to Ida. She noticed on the 4th day. She stood at the fence and looked at it for a moment and then walked back to the house without a word. He expected that to be the end of it, until she came out 20 minutes later with a second cup of coffee and set it on the top fence rail next to where he was working and went back inside. He stood there looking at the coffee for a moment before he picked it up. It was the finest thing anyone had done for him in what felt like a very long time. The 3rd week, one of the 2 remaining draft horses went lame with a stone bruise, and Ida came to find him in the barn with a face that was carefully, deliberately neutral, because the look underneath the neutral was the look of someone doing mathematics in their head and not liking the sum. He examined the horse, cleaned and dressed the bruise, improvised a poultice from what he could find in the barn, and told her the animal would likely be sound again in 10 days if it was kept light. He watched the mathematics in her face recalculate. The sum was apparently somewhat more encouraging because the deliberate neutrality softened into something closer to actual relief, and for just a moment she looked, not young exactly, but less weighted than she usually did. "You know horses," she said. "Spent a year working them in Wyoming," he said. "Thomas was good with them too," she said, and then something moved across her face and she turned away and went back to the house, and he understood that she had not meant to say that, and that the saying of it had cost her something. He had been careful not to ask about Thomas Blackwell. He had heard enough in town, from Donald Willis at the feed store, and from the man at the livery stable, and from a woman who had introduced herself as Mabel Fitch, and who had approached him on the street with a series of pointed questions about his intentions at the Blackwell farm, to understand the broad strokes. A good man, by all accounts. A hard-working farmer who had loved his wife and built his land from nothing. A fever, a quick end. A widow who refused to leave and refused to accept help graciously and refused, most scandalously of all, to grieve in the correct and visible way that the county seemed to expect from her. Micah did not think Ida Blackwell was not grieving. He thought she was grieving so deeply and so personally that she had put it somewhere no one could see it, which was a different thing entirely from not doing it at all. He thought about Thomas Blackwell in the evenings, sitting in the hayloft with the Kansas stars spread out overhead and the sounds of the farm settling around him. He thought about what it must take to be a man who built something like this: 40 acres of south field, 30 of north, a solid farmhouse, a good barn, and the kind of woman who could stand in the middle of it after you were gone and plant the fields herself rather than let them lie fallow. He thought it said something important about both of them, and what it said made him feel something he was careful not to examine too closely, in the same way you were careful around embers that you suspected were still hot. It was Clara who first cracked the careful surface of things, as 9-year-olds often do, without any particular malice or even awareness that there was a surface to be cracked. It was a Sunday, the 4th week of May, warm enough to sit on the porch after the midday meal, and Clara had somehow maneuvered herself into a position where she was sitting on the porch steps with Micah and asking him to teach her the knot he had been tying on a length of rope he had found in the barn. "Mama used to sing when she worked," Clara announced, apparently from nowhere, while Micah demonstrated the knot for the 3rd time. "Did she?" he said. "She doesn't anymore," Clara said. "Since Papa died, she doesn't sing or laugh very much. She laughs sometimes. She laughed at breakfast last week when I dropped the egg, but not like she used to." He did not know what to say to this, so he handed her the rope and watched her attempt the knot. "Do you think she's sad?" Clara asked. "I think," he said carefully, "that your mother is one of the strongest people I've encountered, and I think sometimes strong people put their sad in a place where it doesn't show because they've got work to do, but it doesn't mean they're not feeling it." Clara turned this over with the same methodical thoroughness she apparently applied to everything. "Like how water goes underground," she said. "It's still there, it's just not on the surface." "Exactly like that," he said. "I miss him too," Clara said matter-of-factly. "Papa, I miss him all the time. But I help Mama with the chickens so she doesn't have to because she has enough to do." She finished the knot and held it up for his inspection. It was a creditable attempt. "Is that good?" "That's very good," he said. "Try it again." He looked up and found Ida standing in the doorway, and she had clearly heard at least part of the conversation, and her face was doing something complicated that she pressed down before he could read it clearly, and she went back inside without speaking. But he heard very faintly before the door closed the first bars of a song he did not know the name of. It was nothing. It was everything. June in Kansas came in hot and staying, and the wheat in the south field was coming up in rows that were the best sight Ida had seen since November. She had not allowed herself to feel hope in a direct way because hope had proved treacherous enough before, but she looked at those rows of green coming up through the red-brown dirt, and something in her that had been clenched for 7 months released a fraction of its grip. She had not expected Micah Atkins to still be there by June. She had expected the kind of man who drifts to drift again, and had prepared herself for finding the hayloft empty some morning, and had told herself the preparation was entirely practical and had to do with crop management and nothing else. But every morning he was there before she was, already doing whatever the day's most pressing work was, and she had stopped expecting his absence and started expecting his presence, which was a transition she had not noticed making until it was complete. He was not Thomas. She was not confused about this. Thomas had been warm in an open, easy way that filled whatever room he occupied, quick to laugh, quick to speak, the kind of man who made friends inside of 10 minutes and kept them for decades. Micah was quieter, more contained, built differently from Thomas in every way, taller, darker, with that reserved quality that could read as coldness, until you had been around him long enough to see that it was not coldness at all, but rather a particular kind of care, the care of a man who did not speak unless he meant what he said and did not offer what he could not deliver. She was trying very hard not to notice the color of his eyes in the early morning when the light was coming gold and low across the fields. She was mostly failing. The trouble with Garland Prout began in the first week of June. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon with his son, a blocky young man named Denton who had inherited his father's certainty that the world owed him accommodation, and the two of them rode up the lane with the particular air of men who have convinced themselves they are doing a favor. Ida met them at the gate. "Mrs. Blackwell," Garland said, removing his hat with a flourish that was meant to indicate respect and managed mostly to indicate the lack of it. "You're looking well, Mr. Prout," she said. "I see you've got a hired man," he said, looking past her to where Micah was visible at the far end of the north field. "I have," she said. "Word in town is you've done considerable work on the south field," he said. "Fine, fine, but I've been thinking, and I think my original offer was maybe a touch low. I'd like to revise it. Give you a number that reflects the current condition of the land now it's been worked." He named a figure. It was higher than his previous offers, which she supposed was meant to seem generous. It was still not what the land was worth, and more to the point, it was still her land, and she was still not interested in selling it. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Prout," she said. "My answer remains what it was." His expression shifted in the subtle way of a man who had decided to try a different tack. "Mrs. Blackwell, I say this with respect. A woman alone, a young girl, 40 acres of wheat and 30 more going in, this is not a sustainable situation. Come fall, when the harvest needs to come in, where's your help going to come from? Your hired man will have moved on, same as they all do. I've got sons and equipment, and the capacity to manage that land properly. You'd have financial security and no more worries." "What I have," Ida said, "is a south field planted, a north field going in, a horse that is healing nicely from a stone bruise, fence lines that are mended, and no mortgage outstanding on this property. I also have no interest in selling. Good afternoon, Mr. Prout." He held her gaze for a moment, and there was something in his that she did not entirely like. Not threatening, precisely. More the look of a man filing something away for later consideration. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Blackwell," he said. He put his hat back on. He and Denton rode back down the lane. Micah had come up behind her at some point during the conversation and was standing about 10 feet back, not intruding but present. When she turned, he looked at her with that gray gaze that had stopped being unreadable to her somewhere around the third week. "Old story," he said. "Older than the territory," she agreed. "He going to be a problem?" She considered this honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "He might be. He wants the land. Men like him tend to keep wanting what they want." "Then we'll deal with it," Micah said simply. "We." The word sat in the air between them for a moment before he turned and went back to the north field. And Ida stood in the lane and looked at the word for a moment the way you look at an unexpected gift before you decide whether it is safe to accept it. She went inside and started dinner. The evening it rained in June was the evening everything shifted, or at least the evening when the shift that had been happening slowly and quietly for weeks became impossible to overlook entirely. It came on fast, the way Kansas storms did, the sky going from gold to green to black inside of an hour, and Micah was in the barn securing the horses and checking the roof strapping when Ida appeared in the barn door with a lantern, because the wind had taken out the fence section on the south side that they had not yet gotten to, and she had gone out to assess it and had gotten completely soaked in the process, and there was a scratch on her forearm from the wire. He looked at her standing there in the lantern light, dripping, with the rain thundering on the barn roof and the horses shifting in their stalls, and something in his chest did the thing it had been doing with increasing frequency and intensity since roughly the second week. "Let me see that," he said, nodding at her arm. "It's nothing," she said. "I know it's nothing," he said. "Let me see it anyway." She came into the barn and held her arm out with the resigned expression of a woman who has decided that arguing about a minor cut in the middle of a storm is not worth the energy. He found the clean cloth he kept in the tack box and cleaned the scratch with the water from the bucket, and she stood there and let him do it, and the storm was making the barn into its own close, warm world, and the lantern light was making the particular golden color that lantern light makes when everything outside is dark. "You don't have to stay," she said, not unkindly, not as a dismissal, more as if she were saying something she had been carrying around and needed to put down somewhere. He looked up at her. "I know," he said. "I've been trying to figure out why you have," she said. You're not the type that settles in one place out of laziness. And I pay fairly, but I don't pay anything extraordinary. You've been here 2 months and you've done more work than I've asked for every single week." He tied off the cloth with a neat knot and did not immediately step back. "Does it matter why?" he said. "To me it does," she said. "I've had enough of things happening to me that I didn't understand until they were over. I'd like to understand this one while it's occurring." He considered her face in the lantern light. Her dark hair was wet and had come loose from its pins, and her gray eyes, not so different in color from his own, he had noticed were doing that thing they did when she was being very direct about something, that focused, unflinching attention that was one of the most unsettling things he had experienced in recent memory. "I stopped because you needed help," he said. "I stayed because I wanted to. I've been trying to sort out the exact nature of that wanting, and I haven't come to a complete conclusion yet, but it has nothing to do with your farm and everything to do with you." The storm made the only sound for several seconds. "Thomas has been gone 7 months, she said. "I know that," he said. "I don't know what I am anymore," she said, and there was a rawness in the words that he understood had cost her considerably to speak. "I was Thomas Blackwell's wife for 6 years. I knew what that was. Now I don't know if I'm a widow or a farmer or just a woman too stubborn to leave what she built." "I'd say," he said carefully, "all 3 of those things, possibly simultaneously." She laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her, the way Clara had said she did not laugh very often anymore, and it was the most genuinely beautiful thing he had heard in a very long time. "I'm not asking you anything," he said, because he wanted to be clear. "I'm not expecting anything. You hired me to help with the fields and that's what I'm doing. But I won't stand here and tell you the rest of it is nothing, because it isn't, and I don't say things I don't mean." She looked at him for a long moment. The rain drummed steadily on the roof. "Neither do I," she said. She went back to the house. He stood in the barn and listened to the storm until it gentled, and then he climbed up to the hayloft and lay on his bedroll and stared at the barn ceiling and thought that he was, for the first time in a long time, exactly where he was supposed to be. The weeks that followed were not simple. Ida was not a simple woman, and she would not have been well served by a simple man, and Micah had enough sense to recognize this. She did not suddenly open like a door with its latch released. She remained careful, remained watchful, and there were days when he could feel her pulling back from something she had allowed herself to feel, days when she was brisk and businesslike, and answered his questions about the work with tight efficiency, and asked for nothing personal and gave nothing personal, and he let those days be what they were without pressure or complaint. But there were other days. There was a Sunday morning when he came in from the barn to find her at the kitchen table with the farm's account ledger open in front of her and her face looking the way it did when the mathematics were not working out, and he sat down across from her without being invited and said, "Show me." And she looked at him for a moment and then pushed the ledger across the table. They worked through it together for 2 hours. He had a head for numbers, a fact that seemed to mildly surprise her, though he could not quite decide if this was because she had underestimated him or because Thomas had not shared this particular skill, and the distinction mattered in ways he did not feel he could ask about yet. At the end of the 2 hours, with several adjustments made to the spring budget and a clearer picture of what the wheat harvest needed to bring in, she closed the ledger and sat back and said, "You're full of unexpected qualities, Micah Atkins." "So are you," he said. She looked at him with that steady attention. "Such as?" "You're the most determined person I've met in my life," he said, "man or woman. You decided those fields were going to be planted, and you went ahead and planted them with your own hands when no one else was going to do it. Most people, in the situation you've been in since November, would have taken Prute's money and moved on. The fact that you didn't, that's not just stubbornness. That's a particular kind of love. For the land, for what you and Thomas built." She was quiet for a moment. "Thomas would have hated to see those fields go fallow," she said. "He talked about them all through the winter before he got sick. What we were going to plant in the south. what we were going to try in the north. He was so excited about it. Her voice was steady, but only barely. I couldn't let them go. I just couldn't. Even when I was out there with that plow at 5 in the morning thinking I had completely lost my mind. You hadn't, he said. No, she said. I suppose I hadn't. There was a morning a week after that when Clara fell out of the apple tree she had been explicitly told not to climb and scraped both knees and her left palm and cried with the full emotional investment that 9-year-olds bring to physical pain. Ida cleaned and bandaged the injuries with brisk, efficient competence, and Clara submitted to this process while still crying with considerable energy. Micah, who had heard the fall from the north field and come to see what had happened, stood in the kitchen doorway and said, very gravely, "The apple tree wins this round," which made Clara laugh through her tears, which was precisely the right thing to do, and Ida looked at him over Clara's head with an expression he had not seen on her face before, something warm and complicated and careful. There was an evening when they sat on the porch after supper and Clara had gone to bed, and the sky was doing that thing the Kansas sky did in late June, layered with color from the sunset, orange and deep rose, and a purple that was almost theatrical. And they sat in the chairs Thomas had built from lumber he had hauled from Cutter Creek and said nothing for a long time. And the nothing was comfortable in the way that silences are only comfortable between people who have stopped performing for each other. What were you headed for? Ida asked eventually. When you stopped here, what was out west that you were going to? Nothing specific, he said honestly. I had an idea that maybe California had opportunities. Ranching maybe. I'd heard there was work. And now, he turned to look at her in the porch light. Now I think I might have been looking for something without knowing what it was, he said. And I think I may have found it. She held his gaze. She did not look away, which was significant because Ida Blackwell looked away from things she was not ready to deal with directly, and from things she was not afraid of. She did not flinch. That's a lot of thinking for a hired hand, she said, but her voice was gentle. Probably, he said. I've never been good at staying uncomplicated. Neither have I, she said. The stars came out. The Kansas night settled around them. And when Ida Blackwell got up to go inside, she paused in the doorway and said, I'm glad you stopped, and went in before he could answer. He sat on the porch for another hour in the dark, and he was smiling, and there was no one to see it, and he did not care. The trouble with Garland Prout became actual trouble in the second week of July. It came in the form of a conversation Micah had with Donald Willis at the feed store, where he had gone to collect the seed order Ida had placed for the fall cover crop. Willis was a gruff, practical man in his 60s who had apparently decided that Micah was acceptable enough to speak plainly to, because he pulled him aside between the sacks and said, in a low, direct voice, that Prout had been talking around town about a water rights question on the Blackwell property. What water rights question? Micah said. That's the thing, Willis said. Most people don't think there is one, and the property deed is clear as anything. But Prout's been talking to some land lawyer he brought up from Wichita, and there's something about the creek that runs along the south boundary of Ida's land. Prout says the creek's use was part of an original county agreement that predates Blackwell's deed. Now whether that's true or whether it's something he's constructing out of nothing, I couldn't tell you. But he's pushing it, and it could make things complicated for Ida if she doesn't have her paperwork in order. Micah collected the seed order, thanked Willis for the information, and drove the wagon back to the farm with his jaw set and his mind working through the problem from several angles simultaneously. He told Ida that evening after supper when Clara was in bed. He laid it out plainly, the way Willis had given it to him, without softening or dramatizing. Her face went through several things while he spoke. First, a kind of sharp attention, the attention of a woman who has been waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then something that might have been anger, if it had been allowed to fully develop. Then the familiar tightening into a determination that was so characteristic of her that he had come to recognize it the way you recognize weather coming. The deed is in the strong box, she said. Thomas bought this land outright in 1875. He registered everything in the county office. The creek boundary was documented. "Is there anything in the documentation about water use?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I don't know," she said. Thomas handled the legal paperwork. I understood the land and the farming, he understood the legal side. She paused. "There's a lawyer in Cutter Creek, not a Wichita lawyer. A man named Horace Draper. He helped Thomas with the deed registration. If anyone would know the actual state of the documentation, it's him." "I think you should see him," Micah said. "I intend to," she said. "Tomorrow morning." She looked at him directly. "Thank you for Willis telling you and you telling me. Rather than deciding I didn't need to know." "You always need to know," he said. "I wouldn't keep something like this from you." She nodded slowly. "No," she said, "I don't think you would." And there was something in the way she said it that was not just gratitude but something fuller and more considered. Horace Draper turned out to be a small, precise man who took the matter seriously and spent 3 days reviewing the Blackwell deed and its original county filing, and came back to Ida with news that was mostly good but not entirely uncomplicated. The creek boundary documentation was solid, and the water use had been registered as part of the land purchase in 1875. What Pruitt's Wichita lawyer had apparently found was an earlier county document, predating the Blackwell purchase by 15 years, that referred loosely to shared creek use among adjacent landowners in that section. It was vague language from an earlier era of county administration, and Draper's assessment was that it would not hold up if challenged legally, but that it was enough to muddy the waters, so to speak, if Pruitt chose to pursue it and Ida did not have representation. "He's not trying to win a lawsuit," Draper said. "He's trying to make things difficult enough that you decide it's easier to sell." "He has badly misjudged my relationship with difficulty," Ida said. Draper retained himself for the matter for a fair monthly fee, filed the appropriate counter-documentation with the county office, and sent a formal letter to Pruitt's lawyer making clear that the Blackwell water rights were properly established. Pruitt went quiet for a time. Not permanently, Micah suspected, but for now. "What he's doing isn't right," Micah said to Ida on the evening after the legal matter was resolved. They were on the porch again, which had become their place, the two of them in Thomas's chairs with the summer night around them. Using legal leverage to push a widow off her land. Men have been doing it since there were widows and land, and it's still not right. "No," Ida said, "it isn't." She paused. "Thomas would have been furious. He built this land. He'd have hated knowing someone was trying to take it from me after he was gone." "He'd probably also be glad you're not letting them," Micah said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something he had not expected. "Do you think it's wrong," she said carefully, "to feel something new while you're still grieving something old, like there might be room for both of them in the same heart?" He turned to look at her. She was looking out at the field, not at him, but her hands had tightened slightly in her lap. "No," he said. "I think the heart is bigger than we generally give it credit for." She turned to look at him then, and for the first time the look she gave him was not careful or measured or held at a particular distance. It was just direct and open, and something it had taken her months to allow herself, and it hit him somewhere behind his sternum with the force of something he could not name and did not need to. "I think," she said quietly, "that I have been working very hard to pretend that you are only a hired hand." "I know," he said. "I think I've been working hard at it because it was simpler," she said, "and because I was afraid that wanting something new meant I was being disloyal to something old. But I've thought about it a great deal. And I think Thomas would have wanted me to." She stopped. She collected herself. "He was a generous man," she said. "He would have wanted me to be happy." "I think he would have," Micah said. "I don't know what this is," she said, and the honesty of it was so characteristic of her that he could not help it. He reached across the distance between the two chairs and covered her hand with his, and she looked down at their hands and then back up at him, and she did not move away. "Neither do I," he said. "But I'd like to find out if you're willing." "I'm willing," she said, carefully. "Carefully," he agreed. She turned her hand over under his and held it. They sat like that in Thomas's chairs as the summer stars filled the Kansas sky, and it was nothing dramatic, nothing that required announcement or ceremony. It was simply two people who had been circling something true for long enough and had finally, quietly, arrived at it. The harvest began in the last week of August, and it was, by any measure, a good one. The South Field came in with 40 acres of wheat that were better than Ida had dared hope, standing tall and gold under the August sun, and the North Field's corn had established well enough that the fall crop was promising. Micah had hired 2 men from town for the harvest weeks, brothers named Elias and Pete Sutter, who were reliable workers, and who asked no questions about the arrangement at the Blackwell farm, which he appreciated. The 4 of them, Ida, Micah, Elias, Pete, worked from before sunup to after sundown for 10 days, and the wheat came in, and it was stacked, and the numbers in Ida's ledger changed from something worrying into something that, for the first time in months, represented stability. The evening after the last of the wheat was in, Ida made a proper supper, the kind she had not made since before Thomas died: roast chicken and potatoes and biscuits, and a pie from the dried apple stock in the cellar, and the 4 of them ate together at the long table with Clara, and there was something around the table that was close to celebration, which was a thing Ida had forgotten the specific texture of. When Elias and Pete had gone home with their wages and Clara had gone to bed, Ida and Micah stood in the kitchen, and she was washing up and he was drying, which had become its own small domestic ritual over the months, and she said, "The farm survives the year." "It does," he said. "Thomas would be pleased," she said. "He would," Micah said. She turned to look at him, soapy water on her hands, hair escaping its pins as it usually did by evening, a smear of flour on her cheek from the biscuit making that he was aware had been there since mid-afternoon and had been requiring a significant exercise of will on his part not to address. "I'm pleased," she said. "I'm genuinely, properly pleased. I didn't know if I was going to be allowed to feel that again." "You're allowed," he said. She set down the dish she had been washing. She turned to face him fully. And she crossed the small distance between them and put her hand against his jaw and stood on her toes and kissed him, which was something he had not permitted himself to anticipate as a specific event. Though he had thought about it in the general way, one thinks about things one wants very much, and the reality of it was considerably better than the general. He kissed her back with his hands careful at her waist, and she tasted like apple pie and coffee and herself, and the kitchen was warm and the farm outside was settled and the wheat was in, and it was, in the simplest possible terms, exactly right. When they separated, she stayed close, looking up at him, and her expression was open in a way he had not seen it open before, the last careful guard down, or at least lowered far enough that he could see all the way in. "We're going to have to talk about what this means," she said, "practically speaking." "I know," he said. "I don't mind practical. I have a daughter and a farm and a complicated relationship with the county of Harding," she said, "and you were on your way to California." "California can wait," he said. "California can wait indefinitely." "You say that now," she said. "I say things I mean," he said. "You know that about me." She did. That was the thing about Micah Atkins that she had known since about the 3rd week of his being there. He did not say things he did not mean. It was one of the most stabilizing qualities she had encountered in another person, and she had not known how much she had needed it until she had it. "Then we'll talk about it," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. "Tonight I'm going to let myself be happy about the wheat." He smiled. She had not seen him smile often enough, she thought. It did something very good to his face. "That seems reasonable," he said. The conversation they had been deferring happened on a Sunday in September, on the porch, with Clara drawing pictures at the far end of the porch steps and clearly pretending with great enthusiasm that she was not listening. They talked for a long time, the way people talk when they are trying to be careful with something they do not want to damage by handling it carelessly. He told her he had no family obligations calling him anywhere. His parents had both died when he was in his early 20s, within a year of each other, and he was an only child, and there was no one waiting for him in Missouri or anywhere else. He had been moving because movement had seemed like the appropriate response to a life that had not settled into any particular shape, not because he was running from anything specific. She told him about the farm and the debt that wasn't there, and the debt to Thomas's memory that she carried in a different way, and was working on carrying more lightly. She told him about her fears, that she would hold too hard to what Thomas had been, and in doing so push away what Micah was, because they were such different men, and she loved what Thomas had been and was still learning what Micah was. She said this with a directness that was characteristic of her, and that he had come to deeply admire. He told her he was not asking to be Thomas or to replace Thomas or to be measured against Thomas. He was asking, he said, simply and directly, if she thought she might want him as himself, the specific person he was with all of his particular qualities and limitations, on this farm in this county, building whatever came next. He said it with his gray eyes steady on hers and his voice level and clear, and she felt the truth of it in the way you feel truth, not just understand it but actually feel it, somewhere past the thinking. "Clara likes you," she said. "I like her," he said. "She's remarkable. She lost her father. I won't let her get attached to someone who might leave." "I understand," he said. "The question of leaving is one I've already answered for myself. The question is whether you want what I'm offering." "You haven't quite said what you're offering," she said. He met her gaze with that steady, unflinching quality. "I'm offering to stay," he said, "permanently, in whatever capacity you'll have me. I'm not built for half measures, and I'm not interested in arrangements that have exit provisions. If you'll have me, Ida, I intend to be here." Clara, at the far end of the porch, had apparently abandoned the fiction of not listening, and was watching them with her father's dark eyes and her mother's expression of someone doing important calculations. "He should stay, Mama," Clara said. "You are not part of this conversation," Ida said. "I'm part of this family," Clara said with 9-year-old certainty. "That seems relevant." Ida looked at her daughter for a moment with an expression that contained multitudes. Then she turned back to Micah. "She's not wrong," Ida said. "She usually isn't," he agreed. Ida let out a long breath, the kind that carries a decision in it, and looked out at the fields that were hers and that she had kept. And then she looked at the man across from her who had come to help them stay hers, and had stayed for reasons that had nothing to do with the fields at all, and she said, "Then stay." He reached across and took her hand. "Yes," he said simply. The winter of 1882 was cold but manageable, and it was also, in the way that winters on the Kansas plains can be, a time of building, not just the physical kind, though there was plenty of that, the barn repairs and the fence improvements and the new storage building Micah constructed on the north end of the property, but the other kind. The kind of building that happens between people when they have decided to become something to each other, and are in the early stages of discovering what that something is. He proposed to her on a December evening, not with grand ceremony but with the particular directness that was his truest quality. He had spoken to Reverend Fitch, not to Mrs. Fitch, who remained slightly suspicious of the whole arrangement, but to the Reverend himself, who turned out to be a more practical and kind-spirited man than his wife. And he had obtained a ring from a jeweler in Cutter Creek, a simple gold band because she was not a complicated jewelry kind of woman. He had also spoken to Clara, who had received the information with the solemn gravity of someone entrusted with important state business, and had immediately asked if she could be part of the ceremony. He proposed in the kitchen, which was where they were most often themselves, where the most honest conversations had happened, and she said yes before he had quite finished the sentence, which made him laugh and made her look slightly embarrassed, and then stop being embarrassed and laugh too. And Clara, who had been stationed on the other side of the kitchen door because she had somehow obtained advance intelligence about the evening's proceedings, came bursting through it immediately afterward with the force of someone who had been waiting for this moment for some time. "Can I call you Pa?" she demanded of Micah. "If you want to," he said. "I want to," she said, with the same decisiveness her mother brought to everything. He looked at Ida over the top of Clara's head, and Ida's eyes were bright in the kitchen light, and she was wearing Thomas's ring still on her right hand because she had moved it there when she'd put Micah's ring on her left. And she was looking at him with the full force of who she was, all the determination and depth and particular brand of love that was hers to give. And he thought he might be the luckiest man in Harding County, Kansas, possibly in the state, possibly in the Republic. They married in February of 1883 in the Cutter Creek Church with Reverend Fitch presiding, and Donald Willis and his wife and Horace Draper, and the Sutter brothers in the pews and Clara in a white dress that Ida had stayed up 3 nights to make, standing at the front looking very serious and very proud. The ceremony was straightforward and honest, which suited both of them, and when Reverend Fitch pronounced them married, Micah kissed his wife with Clara beaming beside them, and the small congregation applauding with genuine warmth. Mabel Fitch, to her credit, had come around considerably by February. She had brought a second pie in November, this one with no suggestions attached, and had told Ida privately that she thought Micah Atkins appeared to be a solid and respectable man, and that she hoped they would be very happy. Ida had thanked her with genuine warmth and had found that she meant it. Garland Prout did not attend the wedding. He had made one final approach about the property in October, appearing at the farm gate on a Saturday morning with his hat in his hands, and a new offer that was, admittedly, his best yet. Micah had been there, standing alongside Ida at the gate, not speaking, not threatening, simply present in a way that communicated clearly that the arrangement at the Blackwell farm was not the one Prout had imagined. Ida had declined with the same courtesy she always maintained and no invitation to persist, and Prout had looked at Micah for a long moment and then departed. He had not returned. The spring of 1883 brought the second planting, and it was different from the first. It was different because Micah was there as a permanent fixture of the land itself now, as Ida's husband and Clara's father and the co-owner of the Blackwell farm. She had insisted on keeping the name, which he understood and supported without reservation. It was different because the fear that had been underneath everything during the previous spring, the fear that this was not sustainable, that she was fooling herself, that the whole enterprise of keeping Thomas's farm going was a form of grief rather than a form of life, had resolved itself into something that was simply life. The work was still hard and the land still demanded everything you had, but it was no longer something she was doing instead of falling apart. It was something she was doing because it was hers, and she loved it. Micah took to the work of the farm with the same quiet, thorough efficiency he had brought to every task since the first day he walked through her gate. He had not tried to change the way things were done, which she appreciated, though when he had ideas, and he had good ones, he proposed them clearly and listened to her response, and they decided together. She had not expected the together part to be as sustaining as it turned out to be. She had been alone in her decisions for 7 months and had been proud of managing. Managing together, as it turned out, was a different and better thing. That summer, Ida learned she was pregnant. She told Micah on an evening in June when the light was doing its particular golden hour performance across the wheat field, and he sat very still for a moment, the way he sat still when he was taking in something large, and then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Something unguarded and full, something she recognized as joy because she had been allowing herself to feel it again and knew it when she saw it. He pulled her close and held her there, and she let herself be held, which was something she had been practicing, the practice of accepting care without immediately converting it into something practical and manageable. She was getting better at it. How do you feel about it?" he said, his voice careful. "Happy," she said from within his arms. "Frightened, grateful," she paused. "How do you feel?" "The same 3 things," he said, in roughly the same order. They told Clara, who received the information with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything, asked 3 clarifying questions, and then said, "I'd prefer a brother if possible." which made both of them laugh until they were nearly crying, which was the correct response. Clara's preference was, as it turned out, accommodated. In February of 1884, on a cold, clear night when the stars were out over the Kansas plains in extraordinary number, Ida gave birth to a son. He was healthy and loud and had Micah's gray eyes and what looked like it was going to be Ida's dark hair. And when Micah held him for the first time in the farmhouse bedroom where Thomas Blackwell had died and been grieved, and where Ida had spent so many months rebuilding herself, he looked down at this new, complete small person with an expression that Ida watched from the bed and knew she would not forget for the rest of her life. "He needs a name," Ida said. "He does," Micah agreed. They had discussed names. He had said she should choose, and she had said they should choose together. In the end, after the discussion, there had been a name that had settled into the conversation the way right things settle. They named him Thomas, for the man whose fields had been kept and whose land had been loved, and they named him for the man who had built this place, and they did it not as grief but as a bridge between what had been and what was and what would be. "Thomas Micah Atkins," she said. Micah looked at the baby and then at his wife. "That's a good name," he said. "It is," she agreed. Clara appeared in the bedroom doorway in her nightgown, with her dark eyes gone soft, and her 9-year-old dignity temporarily suspended. She looked at the baby in her father's arms, her father, because that was what Micah was and what she had called him since December, and something on her face moved through the stages of initial assessment to something gentle and permanent. "He's very small," she said. "He'll grow," Micah said. "Can I hold him?" "When you've washed your hands," Ida said. "Come here." Clara came to sit on the edge of the bed, and Micah transferred the baby with careful hands, and Clara held her brother with the focused intensity of someone taking on a serious responsibility, and the farmhouse was warm and lit by lamplight, and outside the Kansas stars were burning over the fields that were planted and would be planted again in the spring. The years that followed were full ones. Hardin County, Kansas in the mid-1880s was a place of continuing change, of drought years and good years, and the constant negotiation between the land and the people who tried to live on it. There were lean seasons and full ones, seasons when the wheat came in strong and seasons when the rain did not come, and you stretched what you had and planted again the next spring because that was what you did. Micah turned out to be a man who was very good at the long game, not just the season-to-season work, but the sustained, strategic thinking about what the farm needed to grow into something more than survival. He proposed in the fall of 1884 that they purchase an additional 20 acres on the east side of the property that had come available when an older farmer named Taggart sold his homestead to his son, and the son did not want all of it. The numbers, which Ida worked through with him on the kitchen table over 3 evenings, supported the purchase. They bought the land. By the following year it was under cultivation. Ida had not stopped being the woman she was before Micah came. She was still the one who kept the accounts in her ledger with precise attention, still the one who made the practical decisions about the farm's direction with clear-eyed assessment of what the numbers said. Still the one who could out-argue any man in Cutter Creek who thought she could be maneuvered or diminished. She had simply added to this the thing that the 7 months alone had taken from her, the ability to let someone in, to share the weight without feeling that the sharing diminished her grip on it. Garland Pruitt, it was eventually discovered, had been engaged in a series of similarly questionable legal maneuvers against several other landowners in the county. And Horace Draper, who had a long memory and a meticulous nature, had accumulated documentation of this pattern that was ultimately presented to the county authorities in 1885. Pruitt did not lose his property, but he lost considerable standing in Hardin County and ceased to be a practical threat to anyone for several years thereafter. The county, slowly and imperfectly, was working through the question of what justice looked like on the frontier, and it did not always find a satisfying answer, but in this particular case the outcome was a reasonable one. Clara grew up. This happened in the way that children growing up always happens gradually, and then suddenly, and the 11-year-old became a 14-year-old, and then a girl of 17 who was sharp and funny and thoroughly herself, with her father Thomas's dark eyes and her mother's absolute refusal to be underestimated, and a quality she had apparently acquired somewhere on her own that Ida described as a terrifying confidence and Micah described as leadership. She could ride better than either of her parents. She had her mother's head for numbers, and she had Micah's ability to look at a practical problem from every angle before she moved. She had also, by the time she was 16, developed a fierce attachment to a young man named Henry Marsh, whose family had come to Harding County in 1882 and established a successful horse ranch 3 miles west of the Blackwell farm. Ida had opinions about this that she expressed to Micah with her customary directness. "She's 16, she said. 17, Micah said. "As of last month." "You know what I mean," she said. "I do," he said. "And I think Henry Marsh is a good young man, and I think Clara is fully capable of assessing the situation accurately, since she is her mother's daughter." Ida considered this. "She is that," she said. "You were 22 when you married Thomas," he said. "I was," she acknowledged. "So we have time," he said. "They have time." Clara, who was not being consulted in this conversation, because it was occurring quietly in the kitchen after the children were theoretically in bed, turned out to be fully aware of her parents' assessment of the situation, because she told them both the following Sunday that she had no intention of making any hasty decisions about anything, and that she would appreciate it if they expressed their confidence in her judgment more overtly and their concerns less so. Micah looked at Ida. "She's your daughter," he said. "She's absolutely your daughter too," Ida said firmly. They expressed more confidence in Clara's judgment. Clara, for her part, took her time because she was, as established, her mother's daughter and not given to impulsive decisions. Henry Marsh turned out to be as good a young man as Micah had assessed, but that was a story for a later chapter of the Atkins family history, and not one that needed to be fully told here. Little Thomas, who grew up to be a boy of remarkable energy, and the kind of curiosity that kept his parents on their toes, became at age 4.5 the self-appointed assistant to every operation on the farm, and at age 6, a genuinely useful small person whose feel for the horses was so natural that it startled even Micah, who had grown up around them. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair and his own particular personality, which was a blend of both and something else entirely, a sunnier temperament than either parent, quick to laugh, easy in his own skin, the kind of child who made every room slightly better for being in it. Thomas Micah Atkins was, without question or competition, the most enthusiastic planter of fields the Blackwell farm had ever seen, and by the age of 7, he was following Micah through the south field at planting time with a miniature version of the tools and an absorption in the work that made Ida stop what she was doing and watch them sometimes, the big man and the small boy moving in the same patient rhythm through the same land, and feel something so full and complete she was not sure she had a proper name for it. In the spring of 1888, Ida discovered she was pregnant again. She was 34 years old, which was not so old that the news was startling from a medical standpoint, though it was enough that she had not particularly expected it. She told Micah on a morning in March when the light was still cold and the first preparations for the spring planting were beginning, and he received the news with the same quality of attention he gave everything completely, without reservation. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am," she said. "Are you?" "More than," he said, and kissed her forehead, and held her in the kitchen for a long moment while the coffee went on heating, and the farm morning began its usual series of urgent demands outside. The pregnancy went smoothly, and in October of 1888, in the farmhouse that had seen both grief and joy in considerable quantities, and that stood as solidly as anything built by honest labor on honest ground can stand, they welcomed a daughter. She was small and fierce-looking even as a newborn, with dark eyes and a way of examining whoever held her that suggested deep thoughts in progress. They named her Ruth Eleanor Atkins, after Micah's mother, who had been Eleanor, and a family friend of Ida's, who had been Ruth, two women who had deserved more acknowledgement than they had received in their own lives, and whose names now belonged to this new small person who seemed, from her very first days, like someone who would know how to carry them. Thomas, at age 4.5, was fascinated by his sister and appointed himself her primary protector immediately, a role he prosecuted with considerable seriousness. Clara, at 16, was home on a visit from the school in Cutter Creek she had been attending for 2 years, and held her new sister with the practiced confidence of someone who had done this before and remembered clearly what it was like. "She looks like she already has opinions," Clara said. "She comes by it honestly," Micah said. Ida, from the bed, looked at her husband and her children, all 3 of them, one born of her first marriage and 2 of her second, all 3 of them fully, completely hers, fully, completely his, and felt the particular quality of gratitude that is too full to say directly. So she did not say it directly. She said it the way she had learned to say things in the years since the barn storm, with a look that was fully open and fully present, and Micah received it the way he received everything she gave him, with complete attention and a response that was exactly sufficient. He came to sit on the edge of the bed, carefully, and took her hand, and they looked at their daughter together. The south field was planted. The north field was planted. The 20 acres on the east were going in for the 6th consecutive year. The barn was solid and the fence lines were mended, and the farmhouse had 2 additional rooms that had been added in 1886 to accommodate the growing family, and the ledger in the kitchen drawer showed numbers that Thomas Blackwell, 7 years in his grave, would have recognized as the product of exactly the farm he had built, and the woman he had loved to build it with him. Ida thought of him still. She had stopped feeling guilty about the thinking. She had stopped feeling guilty about the not thinking of him on the days when the present was so full that the past did not have its usual weight. Thomas was part of this place and this life, not a ghost or an absence but a foundation. The one who had started building it, the one she had kept building it for, the one whose field she had refused to let go fallow out of a pride that was also love, and the love had been the right thing, had been the thing that had eventually brought her to the gate on an April morning to negotiate wages with a gray-eyed man who had been passing through on his way somewhere else. She said this to Micah one evening, years later, on the porch, in the chairs that were Thomas's chairs, and also now simply the chairs on the porch of the farm that was all of theirs together. "I think he sent you," she said, which was the closest she had ever come to something mystical, and she knew it and said it anyway. Micah thought about this. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe 2 people ended up in the same place at the right time because of choices they made." "Can it be both?" she said. "Probably," he said. He looked at her in the evening light. "I stopped," he said, "because I saw a woman who needed help. I stayed because I couldn't leave, and I've been here ever since." "Here ever since," she repeated. She looked out at the fields in the late light, the long gold of a Kansas autumn evening, the wheat stubble and the turned earth and the 2 horses in the near pasture, and the barn that stood solid against the darkening sky. "I'm glad," she said. "So am I," he said. Inside the farmhouse, Thomas was explaining something with great energy to his sister Ruth, who at age 2 had developed the capacity to respond to things she did not yet entirely understand, with an expression that suggested she was following the conversation more closely than you might expect. Clara was in the kitchen. She had come for the weekend from the home she now shared with Henry Marsh, whose family's horse ranch and the Blackwell farm had, over time, become more closely connected than any of them had initially planned. There was the smell of something cooking and the sound of familiar voices, the ordinary sounds of a household full of the lives it contained. Micah reached over and took Ida's hand, the way he had taken it on the porch the first evening she had let him, and she curled her fingers around his and held on, and the Kansas evening came down around them, and the fields were planted, and everything they had made was here, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the full, good thing that a life can become when you choose, carefully and completely, and without reservation, to stay. The stars came out over Harding County, Kansas, in the autumn of 1890, the same stars that had been there in the spring of 1882, when a widow had been alone in her south field with a plow too heavy for one person, and a pride that was also love and a refusal to let go of what mattered. The same stars that had been overhead the morning a cowboy had slowed his horse on the road and stopped, and found a reason he had not known he was looking for. The fields were planted. They would be planted again in the spring. And the people who planted them were, in every sense that mattered, exactly where they were supposed to be.